As you can tell, it's really nice weather outside, so you might be wondering why I'm deciding to make a quilt in the middle of summer. And that's a good question. So I've finally reached the point where I have hoarded enough different scraps of fabric to actually start the patchwork project that I have been dreaming about for so long, which is making a patchwork quilted coat. The foundation of this project was really two things: figuring out what fabric I wanted to use together and figuring out the formation of the pattern. I started with this 10 by 10 centimeter square, which I used to cut out pieces from all the different fabrics I wanted to include. And because I was pretty much using up my entire stash of scrap fabric, I knew from the beginning that this jacket was going to involve a lot of different colors, patterns, textures. I really love mixing patterns, and I'm not afraid of things being a little bit mismatched as long as there's some thought behind how the colors and patterns sit next to each other. So I needed to figure out what kind of quilting pattern would make all of this chaos feel a little bit more intentional. There were two images on my mood board in particular that I kept coming back to, which was these two images. And I wondered if I could maybe somehow combine the two. So taking the idea of these sort of quarter square shapes and turning them into little squares made up of two different fabrics. So I started pairing fabrics together and trying to get a sense of what the overall vibe of the jacket might become. But I quickly realized that I couldn't think about the entire jacket at once. There was just too many fabrics and too many possible combinations. Instead, I decided to focus solely on pairs of fabrics. So I'd look at one piece and ask myself, what do I think would look good with this? And then I'd take that new pairing and move on to the next one. The idea was that even if every square ended up looking completely different from the one next to it, there would still be some sense of unity within each little section. Hopefully that would be enough to bring some harmony to what was otherwise going to be a pretty chaotic mix of colors and patterns. And then of course came the very, very lengthy process of actually making all of these squares. First cutting out all of the large squares and then cutting each one into 4 triangles, sewing those together into 4 smaller squares, and then combining those into 2 rectangles, and finally sewing those together into one finished piece. And then just continuing that over and over again, and of course pressing every single step along the way. But honestly, I absolutely loved watching all of these different fabrics starting to come together. Every square somehow had its own personality, and they all give me a slightly different feeling. Some feel very cottagecore, some have a bit of a Vivienne Westwood energy, others feel more like a Scandinavian girl who somehow ended up with a slightly chaotic fabric stash. And I think that's what has made this project so fun for me. If you're feeling overwhelmed by starting a patchwork project, especially when you're trying to decide which fabrics are supposed to go together, I actually think that it can help to just think in pairs of 2. Even if you're making something where all of the fabrics eventually touch each other, you don't necessarily have to figure out how everything works together at once. I think patchwork can feel overwhelming because there's this temptation to make everything coordinate perfectly, especially when you're working with so many different colors and patterns. And I definitely worried about things looking too chaotic, but I realized that for me, as long as there's some thought and unity between either neighboring pieces or within smaller sections, I can just trust the process and let the chaos unfold. Unsurprisingly, I think this one is my favorite. Hello friends, it is many days later. I have been sewing little bits together for days now, and you want to see how much days and days and days of sewing scraps together gets you? This neat little pile here. Actually, it's kind of a lot. I think I have close to 30 pieces now or something like that, which isn't bad, but I just need about almost double what I already have. I have also made it very hard for myself. And I haven't even gotten to the white pieces or whatever fabric I choose to have like in between each of these scraps of fabric. So that'll be fun to cut out as well. I guess we'll see how long that takes. But I haven't bought the fabric yet for that. But I'm gonna just continue working. I almost don't know where I left off last. It's been like about a month or so since I kind of abandoned this project a little bit, but I'm back and ready to go. And now I finally have my quilting batting and my cotton poplin, which I'm gonna use for the rest of the squares that I'm now gonna start cutting out. So I finally felt like I had enough to start cutting out the white cotton poplin sections and start piecing together with my patchwork pieces. So I cut out slightly bigger squares of 11 by 11 centimeters since my final patchwork pieces somehow were a bit bigger than the squares I cut from. And then I could finally start piecing everything together. The part of trying to make this all come together was definitely a bit trickier because, again, I was trying to make sure that neighboring pieces kind of were friends with each other in the color scheme, but there were just some points where I just had to be like, this is good enough, and realized that not every section was going to be perfect, but that's okay. We're still just working with different areas, and I think all in all, it still looks like a pretty cohesive piece, even though everything is so different. So I'm back from vacation and ready to tackle this project again. It's been spanning over the past 2 months. And although I really enjoyed the beginning of creating all these little different patchwork pieces, every time that I thought that I was about to be done, I realized that I needed like 20 more squares. And that's happened to me at least 3 times now, which now I'm at the point where I am kind of over making this patchwork. But I think that I'm almost at the end. So yeah, kind of over it at this point. But I'm just gonna have to do a little bit more and then I can finally start working on actually making the jacket and making the quilt. I got to sewing everything together and this was what the fabrication was starting to look like. And I must say that I am obsessed. To me, this chaos of colors and combinations looks so beautiful together. All of these different colors makes me so happy and I love seeing all of my favorite fabrics all together at once. I am almost at the point where I can start cutting out my pieces that I need for the jacket, but before I do that, I need to cut out my pattern pieces to determine whether I need to add a little bit more on the length or the width of my fabrication for this patchwork piece. I'm using the Luna Vest by Puff and Pencil, which I've already used for a previous project where I shortened it quite a bit. I'm not going to be shortening it quite as much as I did there, but I am going to be making a few adjustments that I just wanted to show you. So what I'm thinking of doing here, first of all, I have shortened it already, but not as short as the previous jacket that I made. So this one, I've taken about 12.8 centimeters off of the total length of the short version of the Luna Vest. But then, because it does flare out quite a bit, and I don't really need it to flare out that much, I am contemplating if I should take it in about an inch and just have it be a little bit more straight in the overall fit of the jacket. But I'm scared that this might not look good. It's just that with my other jacket, it just flares out so much that the back is just quite wide, where I don't really want it to be like that. So I do think I'm gonna do it like this. My patchworking is finally done, and thank God, because I could not take another second of making these squares. It looks so beautiful. I'm so happy. I love all these colors, but in the end, I was just done making more of these squares. I even have added, as you can see up here at the end, I have added a little white strip because my pattern piece only sticks out a tiny little bit for everything to fit, so I just added a little bit of white. I also was missing exactly 2 squares to be able to complete this. So there is this little white spot up here. It might seem silly to you that I spent all of this time making this entire patchwork and then I couldn't be bothered to do 2 more patches, but I'm done. I cannot do any more. I just can't. So I was just like, whatever, you're done. And I'll just have to line it up with something where it won't be super visible. But I have tried playing Tetris with my pattern pieces over and over again, and I think I found something that works, but there is this much left of the overall fabrication. It is very tight. Look, I did actually really enjoy the process in the beginning. I think what broke me was the fact that every time I thought that I was close, I was nowhere near being close. There is a total of 82 squares used to make this fabric. If you times it by 2, you will get the amount of actual squares I started cutting out. So that is 164 squares cut out to make this. You can times that by 8 for how many times I needed to cut out every single square into smaller squares. Every time that I ran my rotary cutter through to make even smaller squares. So yeah, I'm pretty done with doing this. Okay, I think I'm just gonna have to try. I am gonna start with the back. So I'm gonna cut that on the fold. So I started cutting out my pieces and it was pretty tight. I had to move things around and play Tetris multiple times with some of the pieces to make sure that I got the best pieces out of my fabrication. And then I went over all of the seams that I cut through and made sure to sew over the seam with a couple of back stitches so that the seams wouldn't rip. For the quilt batting and the lining, I made sure to cut out about 1 inch larger than the actual pattern piece because it would be pretty hard to line up all 3 of these pieces that I'm going to be quilting together perfectly. So just to make sure I had extra room to work with, I just cut them out a bit larger. And then I just pinned all 3 layers together, mostly along the sides. There are some special safety pins, or there's even temporary adhesive that you could use to hold the pieces together when quilting, but I just didn't feel like going out and buying yet another contraption if I might not be needing it again. And now it was time for quilting. I decided to make quilting lines that would go on the diagonal of the jacket to just sort of break up the squares a bit. So I tried drawing lines one at a time because my fabric marker wasn't very strong, so I could barely see what I was doing. And then I started out with trying to stitch all this together with my regular sewing foot. And it was okay, but it was definitely tugging a bit on the fabric and it wasn't super pretty in some places. It's quite hard when you're sewing this many layers together to get all of them to go through the machine in the same way. And it was right at this moment that a package I had ordered finally came. I did end up buying a walking foot because this is definitely something that I can use in other projects as well in the future. But basically what this does is that it helps move all of the fabric through the machine at the same time so that you shouldn't end up having any puckering going on. And I must say that this was so much easier to work with. Before getting this, I honestly didn't understand why it was so necessary to have a walking foot for certain situations, and I'm not saying that it's absolutely necessary, but honestly it made such a big difference in sewing all the quilting together. So in my opinion, this is definitely worth getting. When I done one side of the front with the quilting lines, I was very careful about measuring out where the line should go on the other side of the front jacket piece. So I measured them up against each other and then I drew in the middle line of the jacket first and then tried to make sure that all of the following lines were equally spaced apart but still matched up the other side of the jacket. Then I also needed to figure out what kind of trim I wanted to use on the jacket, and for this I chose to work with the remaining parts that I had of this old men's shirt, which I was going to turn into bias binding. At first, I had considered just going with a solid color to not clash too much with all of the different patterns going on, but I couldn't really decide on a color I felt like looked good enough to go with all these patches. Ultimately, I chose this shirt that I already had because instead of working against the patchwork, I thought that the gingham would tie in quite nicely with all of the different lines and checkers going on, while also being sort of a subtle color, so it wouldn't clash too much. So I cut out 7cm strips on the diagonal and then started piecing them together to make bias tape. I sew them together by placing the two pieces together on the perpendicular and then stitch them together in a diagonal line. I then press out all the seams and then I get out my bias tape maker and start running the whole long strip through this under the iron. I also used this old shirt to make the collar for the jacket, which I quilted the same way that I did the rest of the jacket, with the quilt batting and the lining underneath, and cutting it out slightly bigger than the pattern. I think that I'm finally at the point where I can attach the jacket together, which is huge because it's been over 2 months at this point. I think I've decided against putting pockets on the front of the jacket. I'm gonna see if I can try and attach a little side pocket here, but it is going to have to sit up quite far, plus the jacket is quite oversized, so it's gonna sit a little bit far out. I'm gonna try and see if I can make it work without the bottom hitting the bottom of the jacket too much. I might end up doing front pockets. I didn't really like the way that it was looking. But yeah, I think I'm ready. The construction should be fairly simple, I think. The lining is already attached to the jacket. All the seams are gonna be bound with bias tape, so should be fairly simple. I started cutting away the excess batting from all the pieces, and then I started by attaching the side pockets to the side of the jacket, which I placed around 4.5 centimeters down from the armhole. I had to freestyle a little bit on this part from the pattern because I had shortened the jacket so much. Then I could attach the shoulders right sides together and sewing it with a straight stitch. I decided to continue using my walking foot for this part just to ease up on all the layers that were going through my machine. I thought it would be best. I wanted to bind all of the edges on the inside with bias tape too, so I started by attaching one unfolded side of the bias to one side of the shoulder seam and sewed it down right in the ridge of the bias tape. Then I fold over the rest of the bias tape to the other side of the seam and then stitch that down. If there were any places where my seam was just a little bit too big for the bias tape to reach all the way down to my first line of stitching, I would just snip away a bit of the seam allowance with my scissors and continue. I made sure to press the seam to one side of the shoulder, and then here I also decided to top stitch down the seam from the right side. I then attached the sleeves to the shoulders and proceeded with finishing it with bias binding as well. I just wanted to show you quickly how the jacket is coming along. I've sewn up one side. So I have a bit of a problem because I've had to shorten the pattern jacket quite a bit because, first of all, I wanted it to have a bit more of a crop length than the actual pattern does. And also I didn't have enough fabric, which means that when I stick my hand into the side pocket here, it actually is showing a little bit down at the end. I think I have two options. The first one is that I try and tack down the pocket on the inside in between these lines where I've done the quilting. See if I can somehow attach it there so it's not noticeable from the outside. If that doesn't work, I think I'm gonna have to take these pockets out, and then I might have to do front pockets, although I don't really want to put front pockets on this jacket. I feel like it's gonna be a little bit too much, but I think it needs to have some kind of pocket. So yeah, we'll see. So I closed up the whole side, including the pockets facing right sides together. I did bind the edges of the sides here as well, except for the pockets, which I just overlocked because I didn't want any extra bulk around this area. And And then once that was closed up, I pinned the pocket bags to the front of the jacket and lined up the pins with the stitching lines of the quilt so that I could tack down a few places around the pocket bag without it being noticeable from the outside. Then I moved on to attaching the bias binding to the entire front of the jacket, starting from the very top corner and going all the way around the edges, including the entire neckline. I attached it the same way as before, but then when I made it to the corners, I just snipped into the bias binding a little bit before turning it to the next angle. Then I sewed it down, first from the inside, then turning it over to the other side, and then top stitching from the front as close to the edge of the bias binding as possible. I also attached bias binding to the entire collar piece. Whenever I made it to the corners on this piece, I also just made sure to trim off a bit of the collar so that the edges would sit a bit nicer. I could then pin the collar to the jacket, and since the edges on both the collar and the jacket were bound with bias binding, it made it super easy in attaching. I just placed the bottom of the collar right sides facing the jacket and just stitched along the edge. Then came the part that I struggled with quite a bit, which was attaching the snap buttons. First of all, when you need to swap out the different attachments, you need to press on this little plastic thing to pop them out, and it was so hard for me to get them out. I really struggled with this. And then it was especially hard when I was attaching the top buttons. Every time I tried to film this part, I just completely broke the snaps. So I eventually just had to turn off my camera and figure this out. But finally, the jacket was finished. You guys, I am obsessed with this jacket. I think it's one of the best things that I've ever made. I love it. I'm obsessed. I think it turned out so much better than I'd hoped. I'm wearing all of my favorite patterns and colors that I've used in a few previous projects, and it's just so nice to wear them all at once. I love especially the trim and the collar that I decided to make out of the men's shirt that I had. I think it goes so well with this, even though it's like another pattern added. I think that it's subtle enough that it works. I'm pretty happy that I didn't end up using just a solid color. It's kind of funny because I feel like actually the back, this sleeve and the back here, they kind of match up in very similar colors. Same with this side, I think matches pretty well. And that was kind of, I didn't even really think about that, to be honest, when I cut it out because I was so limited on fabric. So I didn't even think about that, but it turned out to match up pretty well. There are probably two things that I would have changed if I were to make this over again, also in case you're going to make something similar to this. The first thing is the snap buttons. This is probably the biggest mistake that I made. I think that you probably should add interfacing, something to stabilize the buttons a bit more. Could also be that I just chose buttons that were too big for the thinness of my fabric. I don't know why, but I kind of thought that if I had 3 layers of fabric together that it would be fine to not interface. But I've had a few times where the buttons have fallen out of the jacket after I've tried to unsnap them. So I'm a little bit sad about that. Like, I feel like I can't really close it without being scared of them falling out. I did try. That was a bit scary, but I did with this top one, I did add in a piece of cotton with interfacing on to the back. And yeah, that's kind of just sitting there to stabilize the fabric a bit more. I might have to do that with the rest of them if they keep falling out. That's one thing. It's a bit sad, but I think it's gonna be okay in the end. The other thing I would change is probably the length of the sleeves. The pattern that I followed does have a cuff that you need to add, and I thought that since I didn't want to roll the sleeves up on this, I felt like it was probably going to be fine without the cuff, but in itself, it's just a little bit short. Like, it's not too bad. I also kind of like the boxy look that it gives now that it's hitting kind of just above my wrist. It would have been nice if it was just a little bit longer, but again, not the end of the world. But I am so happy. I love this so much. And again, I think like with all of the different fabrics together, it somehow just works because there's some unity in the way that they're shaped. And that, I think, is enough to make it work in itself. This did take me over 3 months. I started in like mid-end May, and it is now the end of August. It's also super cool having something that you've worked so hard and long on, and then you get to wear it. It's just the best feeling, to be honest. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you're not already a subscriber, feel free to follow along, hit the subscribe button. And thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys soon. Bye!